Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am Danielle, aka Stitcherista here on YouTube, and today is Sunday, March 12th. So I know I don't usually do a video on Sundays, but with Bill starting his part-time job today, I thought I would try out doing a diamond paint with me while I read the true crime stories every Sunday. We'll see. I can't promise it's going to be every single Sunday, but I'm going to do my best because I know people have been missing these stories and it gives me a chance to get some diamond painting done. So I'm still working on Hannah Lynn's Queen of Hearts. Love this one so very much. Let's get right into the story. So I'm definitely going to read one. It might be two, depending on how long some of these are. So the first one is called Snapshots from Hell. Ashley Freeman and Lauria Bible had known each other since kindergarten. The girls were fast friends, almost like sisters. So when Ashley celebrated her 16th birthday on December 29th, 1999, it was no surprise who she wanted to spend the day with. That day would include dinner at a pizza restaurant in their hometown of Welch, Oklahoma, just south of the Kansas state line. Thereafter, the friends went back to Ashley's house where Lauria would be spending the night. At around 5:30 a.m. the next morning, a Craig County 911 dispatcher received a call about a mobile home ablaze on the outskirts of Welch, billowing black smoke into the sky. Firefighters were immediately dispatched to the scene, but they could do very little to save the home, which was all but gutted by the time they arrived. All they could do was quell the flames and pray that there was no one trapped inside. That would turn out to be a vain hope. The severely burned body of 37-year-old Kathy Freeman was found lying on the floor of her destroyed bedroom. Right from the start, it was clear that this was no accident. The fire had its source in a wood-burning stove, and it was obvious to investigators that an accelerant had been used to spread the blaze. Really? The autopsy on Kathy Freeman would also reveal that Kathy had not succumbed to the flames, but had been shot in the head. Ooh, okay, well, definitely murder, right? The fire had been a device to cover up the murder, and that suggested a clear suspect. Danny Freeman was missing, along with his teenage daughter, Ashley. Now, why do people think that they can set a fire and that it's going to hide the real cause of death? No, it doesn't. And as investigators were about to learn, Ashley wasn't the only teenager who had been found in the house that night. The car that they found parked in the driveway was registered to Ashley's best friend, Lauria Bible. The working theory at this stage was that Danny Freeman had killed his wife and started the fire before abducting the girls and fleeing the scene. A statewide bulletin was therefore issued and a search initiated. However, the police and fire crews had both missed something crucial at the burned-out house. Danny Freeman wasn't missing, he was dead. His charred remains were hidden in the twisted wreckage of the trailer. It was Lauria Bible's parents, Jay and Lorene, who found him while they were searching for clues to their daughter's whereabouts. Thereafter, search teams returned to the house and went over the site again more carefully this time. They found no trace of the missing girls. Ashley and Lauria had vanished. Sus, right? What had happened to the girls? Perhaps the most popular theory, fueled by local rumor, was that Danny and Kathy Freeman had owed money to local drug dealers and had been killed when they were unable to pay. The girls had likely been dragged away to be raped and murdered, or perhaps sold into sex slavery. An alternate notion was that the murders were connected to another tragedy that had happened earlier that same year. The Freemans' teenage son, Shane, had been shot and killed by a local deputy while trying to steal a car. The shooting had been ruled justified, but the Freemans had threatened a lawsuit and had been at war with the Craig County Sheriff's Department ever since. Now, the rumor mill was awash with allegations that the cops had murdered the family to make the problem go away. Wow, it's amazing what tales people can spin when something like this happens. But there wasn't a shred of proof to back up these accusations. Still, Deputy David Hayes, the officer involved in the shooting, was asked to take a polygraph. Hayes passed, but that did nothing to make the rumors go away. The Craig County Police were under scrutiny and even more determined than usual to close the case, if only to clear their name, of course. With the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation also involved, no stone was left unturned in the search for the missing girls. Divers were sent to the depths of Grand Lake and to a water-filled quarry near Chelsea. Officers rappelled into a disused mine shaft near Pitcher. I think that it's Picher. The house of a habitual sex offender was also searched after a jailhouse tip-off. A field was excavated after the discovery of some bones which turned out to be of animal origin. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted. Really? Reported sightings took investigators as far afield as California, Mexico, and Canada. None of these efforts bore fruit. The Freeman Bible case would also gain notoriety due to the involvement of two notorious serial killers. In May of 2002, Texas death row inmate Tommy Lee Sells, known as the Coast to Coast Killer, claimed that he was responsible for the deaths. However, Sells' confession did not tie up with the actual crimes and was soon dismissed. Why would you admit to something that you didn't do? He would later admit that he had just wanted a few days out of his cell, leading the authorities on a wild goose chase to non-existent dump sites. Jeremy Bryan Jones was somewhat more convincing, however. The rapist and killer of at least 8 women, Jones entered the conversation in 2005 when he claimed that he was the man who had killed Ashley and Laria. According to Jones, he had killed the adults as a favor to a drug dealer and had abducted, raped, and murdered the girls. Jones claimed that he had tossed their bodies into a mine shaft in Galena, Kansas. When a search turned up nothing, Jones recanted, saying that he had made the whole thing up to gain food and phone privileges. Are you kidding me right now with this? The Jones confession would be the last significant action in the investigation for over a decade. Thereafter, the case went cold, with very little possibility that it would ever be solved. Any forensic evidence had gone up in flames, and there were no witnesses, at least none who were prepared to come forward. But the police did have one important clue, even if they failed to recognize its significance at the time. In the days following the murders, an insurance card was found near the crime scene. It belonged to a young woman who was questioned but swore that she did not know how the card had ended up there. The police left it at that, but perhaps they should have dug a little deeper. The woman in question was dating a local ne'er-do-good at that time, a man named Warren Philip Welch, Phil to his friends and customers. Phil was a man of uneven temperament, quick to anger, and keen to use his fist when annoyed. Most often, those fists were employed against the women in his life, and Phil had served time for domestic violence and for making a terrorist threat. It was also well known in Craig County that Phil Welch was a methamphetamine cook and drug dealer. When not involved in the manufacture and sale of narcotics, he was a student of the good book and was known to sprout long passages from the scriptures. Really? That's rich. That's, But a little side note, they don't know how that insurance card was found on the lawn. When I was dating my first husband, I stayed over his house and were woken up by someone banging on the door at 6 o'clock Saturday morning. And when he answered the door, this guy was like, you broke into my car. I found your license and wallet in my car. What actually happened was that someone else broke into my husband's car first, took all of his crap, and then when he broke into somebody else's car, he left my husband's ID and wallet in that person's car. Yeah, Yeah, so, yeah. Phil Welch frequently hung out with 2 associates of equally questionable character, David Pennington and Ronnie Busick. Given the rumors doing the rounds at the time of the murders that Danny Freeman was a drug dealer and that he had been killed over an unpaid debt. This trio of miscreants should have been of obvious interest to the police. Somehow, they slipped through the cracks and were never seriously considered as suspects. There was another piece of intelligence that flew under the radar of law enforcement during the fallow years of the investigation. It had to do with a rumor about a macabre set of Polaroids. If the stories were to be believed, these were in the possession of Phil Welch, who supposedly kept them in a leather briefcase in his trailer. These pictures have never been found, although several witnesses have come forward claiming to have seen them. They were photographs of Ashley Freeman and Lauria Bible trussed and gagged on a bed. Some of the shots apparently feature Phil Welch lying beside his clearly terrified victims, a grin on his face. By the time the authorities eventually learned of these photographs, both Welch and Pennington were dead. Welch had passed in 2007, Pennington in 2015. That left only Ronnie Busick to answer for the crimes, and Busick had long since quit town. He was eventually tracked to Wichita, Kansas, and extradited to Oklahoma in April of 2018. So by this time, it has been like 20 years since this has all happened. By now 66 years old, morbidly obese, and walking with the use of a cane, Busick initially denied any involvement in the murders. However, he eventually admitted to being an accessory. It was Phil Welch, he claimed, who had killed the Freemans and Lauria Bible. According to Busick, he and Welch and Pennington had arrived at the Freemans' trailer that night to collect on an outstanding drug debt. Danny Freeman was overdue on a payment of $2,800 for 2 ounces of meth he had purchased from Welch. But Freeman couldn't pay, and an argument ensued, during which Freeman went for a gun he had sitting on the table, which was a mistake. Welch was carrying a sawed-off shotgun in his coat and blasted Freeman. Then, deciding that he didn't want to leave any witnesses behind, he had also killed Kathy Freeman. The girls, meanwhile, had heard the gunshots and escaped through a window. They were hiding in the field while the men ransacked the trailer and then set it on fire. Had they kept their heads down, they would likely have escaped. Unfortunately, they stood up to see what was going on and were spotted. Oh, man. They were chased down and caught, dragged to Welch's truck, and then driven 15 miles over rural roads to Welch's trailer in the neighboring town of Pitcher. They would be held here over several terrifying days, during which they were repeatedly raped and subjected to torture. Eventually, Welch grew tired of having them around and strangled them. I can't imagine hearing that family members or friends died in this horrific manner. How do you do that to another human being? This confession was a terrible thing for the families of the victims to hear, but at least it presented the hope that the location of their loved ones' remains would be revealed so that they could be retrieved for burial. Unfortunately, this was not to be. According to Busick, he did not accompany Welch and Pennington when they went to dispose of the bodies. All he knows is that they were thrown into a pit. My good night. Ronnie Busick entered a guilty plea to accessory to first-degree murder in July 2020. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Afflicted with type 2 diabetes, lung disease, and with several tumors growing on his spine, he is very likely to die behind bars. Ashley Freeman and Lauria Bible have never been found. Neither have the Polaroids, those snapshots from hell depicting their terrifying last days. I don't even have words for that. All right, let's read another one. Let's see how long this one is. Ooh, this one's kind of long. Okay, this one is called Double Trouble. Laurie Colanino was the kind of woman who turned heads. Beautiful, vivacious, fun, outgoing. These were words that were frequently applied to the 23-year-old cocktail waitress from Clearwater, Florida. But Laurie was more than just a pretty face. This was a young woman with ambitions. Typical of her, those ambitions involved helping others. In December 1990, Laurie applied to paramedic school. It was her dream to qualify as an EMT. On the afternoon of January 2nd, 1990, Laurie Colanino returned from a workout at the gym. The Bay Point Apartments where she lived was a sprawling complex of 52 detached buildings, each of them comprising 8 units. Laurie entered hers at around 1 p.m., leaving her door open so that her cat could go out. She then picked up the phone and dialed her friend Scott Kelly. Scott had worked a late shift as a barman and was asleep when his phone rang. The pair started talking, but then Laurie suddenly let out a gasp and the phone went dead. Concerned, Scott immediately called back, and all he got was Laurie's answering machine. It would take several tries before Laurie eventually picked up. "Everything's okay," she told him. "I've got to go," and then the phone went dead again. But everything was clearly not okay. Throwing on some clothes, Scott ran down to his car and started driving to Laurie's apartment. He arrived to find the door standing ajar. It was in the bedroom that he found his friend lying on the floor, dressed only in a blood-stained t-shirt and a pair of gym socks. Scott immediately fell to his knees beside Laurie and started CPR. But it was soon clear that it was too late. Laurie was beyond help. Staggering to his feet, Scott went to the phone and dialed 911. And this is case in point why, like today, Bill's not going to be home until probably about 4:30. The door is locked all day while I'm here in the house alone. And during the week when I'm working and he's at work, the door is locked until about 5 minutes before he comes home. Yeah, no. But she was letting her cat out. I mean, you wouldn't think that 1 o'clock in the afternoon that something would be happening. It can happen anytime. You have to stay cautious, people. To the detectives who arrived on the scene, the motive for this terrible crime was easy to determine. Semen on the dead woman's thighs was a giveaway, but whoever had done this also appeared to harbor a great deal of resentment towards the victim. Laurie had been stabbed multiple times. The autopsy would count 16 deep wounds, all of them centered on a small area around the heart. This overkill suggested a personal motive, and right now the police had a good suspect standing right in front of them. Laurie and Scott Kelly had been more than just friends and work colleagues. Turns out they had an on-again, off-again sexual relationship, kind of a friends with benefits thing. Such relationships, although casual in principle, can often lead to festering jealousies. Is that what had happened here? Scott said no and insisted that he had loved Laurie as a friend. And the thing is, though, the phone, I don't know back then, because what year was this? 1990, so there weren't cell phones yet. So it makes you wonder, could they trace that he had been on the phone with her right when it happened? You know what I mean? Scott readily agreed to provide a blood sample for DNA analysis, and back then the lab work could take months. So for now, the police had no reason to detain Scott Kelly. He was free to go. But as investigators were about to learn, Laurie Colanino had a rather convoluted love life. She was currently dating a chef named Eric Held and had an ex-boyfriend named Wayne LaFleur, who she had recently reported for stalking her and for vandalizing her car. Both men were brought in and questioned, and both offered alibis and agreed to provide blood samples. It would be a long wait before DNA could either clear them or flag one of them as a killer. Not that the police were placing all of their faith in DNA. Officers descended on the Bay Point apartments and started questioning residents. This was a massive undertaking, but ultimately it would come up empty. Despite a vicious murder committed in a densely populated commune, no one had seen or heard anything. Months passed without a break. Then the DNA results were back, clearing all of the original suspects. With detectives thinly stretched and dealing with several other homicides, including an ongoing serial killer case, the Laurie Colanino inquiry was quietly shelved, and it would remain stagnant until 1994, so 4 years later. That was when the Pinellas County Cold Case Unit decided to take another look at the evidence. And all the 2020s that Bill and I watched, That's is all it takes, is for another cold case unit or someone to look at the case with fresh eyes, and it can get solved. Technology had moved on in the intervening years. DNA tests were now faster and less expensive. It allowed the investigative team to undertake an ambitious project, testing every adult male who had been living in the complex at the time of the murder. A surprisingly high number of these individuals still called the Bay Point home, and most of them agreed to provide a blood sample. All but one, in fact. The police were having a hard time tracking down Brian Calzacorto, a 31-year-old shoe salesman who had lived in eyeshot of Laurie's former residence. Detectives made several visits to Calzacorto's apartment but never found him at home. Notes were left asking him to get in touch, and each time Calzacorto failed to respond. Sus. That made him a person of interest, obviously, worthy of further examination. And what investigators learned next only deepened their suspicions. It turned out that Calzacorto was a suspect in another murder, the 1986 shooting death of his father, a police officer in his hometown of Donora, Pennsylvania. A grand jury had been convened in that case, but it had been torpedoed by the extended Calzacorto family. Each and every one of them had taken the fifth on the stand, refusing to answer even the most mundane of questions. Even Calzacorto's widowed mother refused to speak up against the son who had likely murdered her husband. As a result, the DA did not get the indictment he wanted. Brian Calzacorto had moved to Florida, where he had taken up residence at the Bay Point Apartments. Now he was embroiled in another murder. The police were desperate to speak to Brian Calzacorto. It would be weeks before they caught a break in tracking him down. That was when Calzacorto's brother Alfred called in and reported him missing. According to Alfred, he had been unable to reach Brian for several days. Using this as cover, detectives agreed to meet Alfred at his brother's apartment. And they were stunned when they saw him, because Alfred was a dead ringer for their suspect. The two of them were identical twins. And that presented investigators with a unique opportunity. Since identical twins have the same DNA profile, they could test Alfred against their crime scene evidence. If they got a match, they would know that Brian was their man. The problem was that Alfred was wise to this. Of course he would know that. He had stood by his brother when he was accused of murdering their father, and he had his back now. He refused point blank to provide a blood sample. Tracking down Brian Calzacorto was now the primary focus of the investigation. But Calzacorto appeared to have abandoned his apartment, and he also absconded from his job. That's suspect. Like, really? Investigators weren't even sure that he was still in Florida. 7 weeks passed before the police got another break. Calzacorto was arrested for theft after he was caught pickpocketing on Clearwater Beach. He would soon find himself under interrogation for a far more serious crime. Dun dun dun. Yeah. But Calzacorto was giving nothing away. Cool and collected under interrogation, he denied knowing Laurie Colanino and claimed that he had been at work when she was killed. He also refused to provide a blood sample. Okay, if you were innocent, first of all, you are an eye shot of her apartment. He probably saw her all the time. If you were innocent, why wouldn't you freely give your blood sample? Well, maybe you wouldn't, because then the police would have it on record, right? But if you were an upstanding citizen, you would want to clear yourself. So without probable cause to obtain a court order, the police had to let it drop. Despite their strong belief that Calzacorto was their man, they were forced to watch him walk away, and he would remain at liberty for the next 5 years. By 2001, Laurie Colanino had been dead for 11 years. Her mother had died in the interim, never knowing who had stolen the life of her beloved daughter, never seeing justice done. The Pinellas County Police, meanwhile, were as determined as ever to take down the killer. They had kept tabs on these names. They had kept tabs on Calzacorto over the years, watched as he moved to Tampa, set up an apartment, and got a job at another shoe store. DNA technology had also made advancements during this time. it was no longer necessary to take a blood sample from a suspect. A profile could now be extracted from any biological material, like a coffee cup in a trash can. I've seen that happen on shows. Criminal cases are often resolved by the most mundane of actions. In the case of Brian Calzacorto, it was the act of taking out the trash. One night in 2001, Calzacorto walked out of his apartment and dumped a trash bag into an outside bin. He then walked back into his building, never knowing that he was being surveilled. The minute he was out of sight, officers emerged to retrieve the bag. It delivered a treasure trove of potential evidence, including a razor from which skin cells were extracted. Subjected to DNA analysis, it provided a perfect match to the semen found at the crime scene. And that should have made this an open and shut case, right? But there was one major complication for prosecutors to overcome. Twins have identical DNA, as we heard before. How could they prove that it was Brian and not Alfred who had raped and killed Laurie Colanino? The defense, of course, was already thinking along these lines. In fact, it is quite likely that Alfred was on board with the strategy. Although he denied on the stand that he had killed Laurie, he did not appear particularly affronted by being accused of murder. It was left to the jury to draw its own conclusions. In the end, it came down to proximity. Alfred had been working in Tampa at that time in a secure building that required him to sign in and out. He had just started the job, which meant that he would not have had time off. Given the 30-minute drive he would have to make either way, it would have been impossible for him to commit the murder. Brian, on the other hand, worked just a short walk from his residence at the Bay Point Apartments. He would have had no problem committing the murder and then returning to work. His semen at the crime scene proved that he had done exactly that. The prosecution argued that Calzacorto had been standing in his apartment when he had spotted Laurie Colanino returning from the gym. He had probably seen her before, perhaps at the complex swimming pool where she enjoyed lounging. Laurie was a woman who easily attracted male attention. Calzacorto had probably been lusting after her for some time, and on this day he decided to act on his desires. Just what I said. He had seen her before. Picking up a knife, he crossed the short distance from his building to hers. Laurie was on the phone when he entered her apartment, but Calzacorto cut the call off. Then after Scott King tried calling her back, Calzacorto forced her to call him and say that everything was okay. He then dragged the terrified woman into her bedroom and raped her. Finally, after satiating his lust, he plunged the knife into her chest, then repeated the action again and again. Laurie tried fighting back, sustaining defensive wounds to her hands in the process. But she was no match for the man straddling her, pinning her down, wielding the blade with deadly purpose. The police had initially theorized that the overkill of the crime suggested a personal motive. They did not consider that the killer might be a bloodthirsty psychopath who got off on the pain and terror he inflicted. So, one of the real tragedies of this case is that Brian Calzacorto should never have been free to harm Laurie Colanino or any other woman. Had his family not closed ranks after the murder of Alfred Calzacorto Sr., then Brian would probably have been locked away, and Laurie Colanino would still be with her loved ones, perhaps a qualified paramedic, perhaps raising a family of her own. Too late, the courts were able to deliver justice to a heartless killer. Brian Calzacorto was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 25 years. Yeah, I mean, that's what happens. These people are not put away when they're convicted or, of a first crime. So they're allowed to commit other crimes, obviously, and most of the time do. Awful, 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 awful things. But I hope you enjoyed seeing me do some diamond painting and reading some true crime stories. I hope you guys all have a great Sunday. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you so much for watching and subscribing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye, guys.